Shall we bow our heads for prayer? Father in heaven, we ask for your presence as we study about the historical and prophetic significance of the book of Esther. We ask for wisdom from on high, and we thank you for hearing our prayer, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. The title of our study today is The Deliverance of the Saints, the historical and prophetic significance of the book of Esther. The first thing that we want to do is study the historical context of this magnificent book. And I'm going to go through this material quite quickly because we have quite a bit of material to cover in our study today. From the year 605 through the year 539 BC, God's people were captive to the kingdom of Babylon. But in the year 539, the Medes and the Persians came to Babylon, and they gave Babylon a deadly wound. And as a result of the deadly wound, the deliverance of God's people from bondage to Babylon was made possible. Now, 3 years later, in the year 536, Cyrus, king of Medo-Persia, gave a decree. And in that decree, he guaranteed for God's people civil and religious liberty. He also told them that they could return to Jerusalem to reestablish their temple service, their religion, with full civil and religious freedom. This decree of liberation that Cyrus gave was given from the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. And so, through Cyrus, God was calling his people out of Babylon, which had received the deadly wound, to return to Jerusalem to restore the truth of God, the sanctuary, and the true religion. It's interesting to notice that very few of God's people actually left Babylon when the decree was given. About 50,000 went back when the first call was made, but there were many, many who chose to stay behind in Babylon in spite of this decree of liberation. In the year 520, 16 years later, Darius, known as Darius Histaspes, gave a further decree authorizing God's people to go back to their land to reestablish their religious ceremonies. A few people heeded the call and went back to Jerusalem to reestablish the temple and the religious services. But most of the people, once again, stayed behind in Babylon. It's interesting to notice that the kingdom which actually gave Babylon the deadly wound and which gave this decree of civil and religious liberty is represented in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 20 as a ram which had 2 horns. The Medes and the Persians are represented by one beast, a ram, which, by the way, a ram is a male sheep. And this ram had 2 horns, which represents that this kingdom was going to be composed of 2 kingdoms, the Medes and the Persians. But several years later, in the year 480 BC, the Ahasuerus, which is mentioned in the book of Esther, also known by the Greeks as Xerxes, suddenly removed the religious liberty and the civil liberty of the Jewish nation and proclaimed a death decree against them. This is the story that is found in the book of Esther. So reviewing, from 605 to 539 BC, God's people were captive to Babylon. In the year 539, Babylon received a deadly wound when Darius the Mede came and conquered Babylon along with Cyrus, his nephew. In the year 536, Cyrus gave a decree of civil and religious liberty for Israel to go back to their land and reestablish their temple and their religion. Very few of God's people left as a result of that decree. Most of them stayed in Babylon. And this was a real problem later on in the days of Esther. In the year 520, another decree of religious liberty was given by Darius, Histaspes, who actually said, go back to your land, rebuild your temple, and reestablish your religion. Once again, they were given civil and religious liberty by this kingdom. But in the year 480, the civil and religious liberty was removed. And interestingly enough, it was removed by the same kingdom and from the same capital which had given the decree of civil and religious liberty originally. And as I mentioned before, this is very important. This kingdom was represented by a ram, a male lamb, having 2 horns, indicating that this was one nation which had within it 2 kingdoms. Now, the book of Esther then is taking place in the year 480 BC. God's people have returned to their land, at least those who heeded the calls of God to come out of Babylon. They've reestablished the temple service. They've reestablished their religion to a great degree. But the book of Esther describes a moment when this religious and civil liberty is removed. Now, I would like to mention the main protagonists or actors of the book of Esther. First of all, we have a political figure, namely Ahasuerus, or Xerxes, which is his Greek name. This individual is the king of the Medes and Persians. He is the civil ruler. He can make civil decrees and he can enforce them. In other words, the political power is in his hands. Secondly, in the book of Esther, we have a religious coalition. We have a man called Haman, who we're going to notice demanded worship. And we're also going to notice that Haman was allied to his wife, a very shadowy figure in the book of Esther. Her name was Zeresh, and she's mentioned primarily in chapter 5. She and Haman were allied together. In the third place in the book of Esther, we have a persecuted figure, which is Mordecai, and of course the Jews, his people. In the fourth place, we have an intercessory figure, and that intercessory figure is Esther herself. And so we have a political figure, we have a coalition of religious figures, we have a persecuted figure or actor, and we have an intercessory figure in this book. Now, what are the issues involved in the controversy that we find in the book of Esther? Actually, the controversy was a long-standing feud. It did not begin in the days of Esther. It actually began when the Hebrew monarchy began in the days of King Saul, when God had told Saul to kill Agag and all of the Amalekites. Saul did not obey God. And as a result, this event, which is taking place hundreds of years later, involves those nations, or that nation, more specifically the Amalekites. Haman, the enemy of the Jews, is actually a descendant of Agag, the Amalekite. Now, not only this, it's very interesting to notice that there are many names in the book of Esther. There are only 2 names that are given completely. You have the name of Haman, which is given in its totality. He's Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. The other name, which is found in its totality in the book of Esther, is the name of Mordecai. He's the son of Jair, and he is of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, it's interesting to notice then that this controversy that we find at this time, in the days of Esther, actually began way back in the history of Israel in the enmity between the Amalekites and the Jews. We're told in the book Patriarchs and Prophets, page 601, that Satan himself was behind this plot in the book of Esther. I'd like to read this statement. Page 601 says, Satan himself, the hidden instigator of the scheme, was trying to rid the earth of those who preserved the knowledge of the true God. The issues in the book of Esther have to do with worship and obedience to the commandments of God, or obedience and worship to the commandments of men, of the king specifically. In fact, let's read Esther chapter 3 and verses 2 and 3. Esther chapter 3 and verses 2 and 3. It says there, and all of the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage. You'll notice here that the king, the civil ruler, had given a decree. And the decree was that everyone should bow and do reverence to Haman. Now somebody might say, well, this is just talking about respect for Haman. Do you know that these words that are used here, first of all, the word bowed, and secondly, the word homage, are used in the Old Testament many times by themselves. And when they're used by themselves, sometimes they refer to an individual who bows before a king as a sign of respect. But every time in the Old Testament where you find these two words together, to bow and to pay homage, every time they are together, it refers to worship to God. And so the civil ruler gives a command to worship Haman. This is equivalent to the state giving a decree that this religious figure should receive worship. So you notice immediately at the beginning of the book of Esther that the controversy is between the commandments of God, which forbid false worship, and the commandments of men. The controversy is between worship only to God and worship to this religious figure by order of the civil power, by order of the king. And of course, Mordecai, we find, decided that he was going to be obedient to God and he was going to worship God. He was not going to obey the decree of the king. And so immediately we notice that the controversy in the book of Esther involves Satan, who wants to destroy the totality of the Jewish nation. We notice that it's a long-standing controversy that began at the very early stages of the Hebrew monarchy with the Amalekites. And later on, we find Haman, a descendant of these people, wanting to destroy the Jews just like the Amalekites did in the days of Saul. And if Saul had destroyed them completely the way God said, this would have been uprooted at that time. Now it's interesting to notice that when Mordecai did not worship Haman by order of the political ruler, that Haman was filled with wrath. Notice Esther chapter 3 and verses 5 and 6. Esther chapter 3 verses 5 and 6. It says there, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. Instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. And so because Mordecai does not obey the king's order and disobey God, the result is that Haman, the religious figure, is filled with wrath against Mordecai. And so we find Haman deciding to go before the king to present his complaint that his civil decree of worship had been disobeyed. Notice what we find in Esther chapter 3 and verse 8. Here we have the accusations of Haman before the civil power because Mordecai does not obey the laws of the king, and Mordecai does not worship Haman by order of the king. It says there in verse 8 of Esther 3, then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. What an interesting argument. A small dispersed remnant, pervasive throughout the whole kingdom. This remnant has different laws than the laws of the Medes and Persians. Therefore, they do not obey the laws of the civil power. And Haman is saying to the king, if you let them remain, it's going to destroy the stability of your kingdom. Because those who don't obey the laws of the civil ruler, the result is that the nation is thrown into upheaval, into chaos. And so it is not profitable for you to keep them around. Now, it's very important to realize that the people were not really a threat to the kingdom of Ahasuerus. They were a threat to the religious supremacy of Haman. But Haman made the king think that these people were a menace to the kingdom because they did not obey the laws of the kingdom and because they did not worship him according to what the king had commanded. And so now, Haman suggests to the king that a decree of death be proclaimed against this minority spread all over the kingdom, whose laws are different than the laws of Medo-Persia, and who refuse to worship Haman by the order of the king. That death decree is found in Esther chapter 3 and verse 9. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. So what Haman is saying to the king is, have a decree written of death against these people. And actually, it will be economically profitable for you. In other words, it will bring economic gain for your kingdom. He actually says that he would pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who did the work of the king. Now, it's important to realize the characteristics of this particular death decree. It was proposed by a religious figure to the political ruler. The political ruler is deceived by this religious advisor. He actually thinks that these people can be a threat to his kingdom, but they're really a threat to the religious figure, not to the political figure. The king implicitly trusts his advisor. The king believes that the remnant are a menace for his kingdom. He appears to think that Haman is his friend and the Jews are his enemies. And he actually says, if you get rid of them, your kingdom will be stable and your kingdom will prosper. Now, it's interesting to notice the characteristics, the specific characteristics of this death decree. First of all, it was a universal death decree. Notice Esther chapter 3 and verse 12. It was universal in the kingdom of that day and age. It says in verse 12, then the king's scribes were called on the 13th day of the first month. And I want you to remember that, on the 13th day of the first month. And a decree was written. Remember that also. A decree was written according to all that Haman commanded. Who is the enemy of the Jews here? Is it the king or is it Haman? It's Haman. According to all that Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, to the officials of all people, to every province according to its script, and to every people in their language. In the name of King Ahasuerus it was written and sealed with the king's signet ring. Notice it says to every province, every people, every language, every script. And the authority behind it is the authority of the civil power. Because we're told that it was done in the name of King Ahasuerus, and it was signed with his seal. In other words, it is a decree of the civil power, but the influence behind this decree comes as a result of the religious figure. So first of all, this decree, this death decree, is universal. Secondly, this death decree is dated. In other words, it is given at a certain point, as we read here, at the first month, the 13th day, but it is supposed to be executed in the future on a specific date. In other words, the death decree has a date in it when it is to be executed. Notice Esther 3 and verse 13 on this point. It says, "And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces." And notice the hatred here: to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate. You'd think that they could just use one word, maybe destroy. But this is real religious hatred. To destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. So you notice that the decree is given on the 13th day of the first month, but it is to be executed on the 13th day of the 12th month. In other words, you have 11 months between the time when the decree is given and when the death decree is to be executed. Another interesting characteristic of this death decree is that it is religious hatred channeled through the political power. And I've mentioned this many times before, but it's important to realize that the king is actually accepting the advice of this religious figure. He doesn't know what's going on. He thinks that these people really are a risk to the kingdom. But it's Haman who is angry because he is not worshipped by the king's command. Now, another interesting aspect of this decree is that everyone was supposed to be ready the day in which the decree was to be executed. Notice Esther chapter 3 and verse 14. It says, "A copy of the document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all people, that they should be" what? That they should be ready for that day. In other words, everyone was told, when that day comes, you be ready to execute the death decree and to kill all of the Jews in the kingdom. Finally, characterizing this death decree was the fact that it was irrevocable. The decrees of the Medes and Persians could not be changed. You know this from the story of Daniel chapter 6 and verse 8, when Daniel was thrown into the lion's den. Regarding this, Ellen White says in Prophets and Kings, page 601, the following: "The decree of the Medes and Persians could not be revoked. Apparently there was no hope. All the Israelites were doomed to destruction." Now it's interesting to notice what Haman and the king did immediately after the decree was signed. Notice Esther chapter 3 and verse 15. It says there, "The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan, the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink." What do you suppose they were drinking? Water? Absolutely not. They sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. So notice here that the king and the religious figure are drinking what? Wine when they give this death decree. And now a terrible time of trouble ensues for God's people. They are under the death decree. And now they mourn and they cry out in agony because they have been marked for death. Notice Esther chapter 4 and verses 1 and 3. It says, "When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes." Do you know that people actually laid in sackcloth and ashes to mourn the dead? So in other words, they had been marked for death, and they are already in mourning because there appears to be no hope, and they're wailing and they're crying out because of this death decree which has been given. It appears that all of them are going to be obliterated by this coalition between Haman and Zeresh and the king. Obviously, Israel needed an intercessor, needed someone to step up to the plate, so to speak, and to intercede before the king so that Israel could be protected. And this is where Esther steps into the picture, the intercessory figure. You see, Esther is the next of kin of Mordecai. She is the next of kin of Israel. Her interests are welded together with the interests of her people because she is one with her people. And so we find in Esther chapter 4 and verses 8 and 9, in this moment of utmost extremity, the following words. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given at Shushan, that he might show it to Esther, that is, that Mordecai might show it to Esther, and explain it to her, that he might command her to go into the king to do what? To make supplication and what? Plead before him for her people. Those words, supplication and plead, have to do with intercession. Notice also Esther chapter 4 and verses 13 through 17. Mordecai lays everything on the line. He says to Esther, listen, God has brought you to this very moment, and you have to decide, you have to make a decision whether you're going to go and intercede before the king to save your people, your next of kin, or not. Notice verse 13. Then Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. Don't you think that just because you live in the palace, everything's going to be okay. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? In other words, God has placed you in the kingdom for this very moment to save your people. They continue saying, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I what? I perish. Were the interests of Esther welded together with the interests of her people? Was her life the most important? No, she was willing to give her life for her people. In other words, she was willing to perish in order to save her people. Later on in history, we're going to find someone else who had the same attitude. Ellen White says in Prophets and Kings, page 601, the following about Esther. She says, Mordecai was a near relative of hers. In their extremity, they decided to appeal to Xerxes in behalf of their people. Esther was to venture into his presence as an intercessor. Now, I want you to notice that Esther here is not interceding for sin. She's not interceding for the sins of the people. She is a protective intercessor. In other words, the purpose of her intercession is to get the king to protect the Jews from annihilation. In other words, it is protective intercession. It is not priestly intercession for sin. Now, it's interesting to notice that before Esther actually goes into the king, she changes her ordinary garments to her queenly garments. Notice what we find in Esther chapter 5 and verse 1. It says, now it happened on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes. Did you notice that? That she put on her what? Her royal robes, and stood in the inner court of the king's palace across from the king's house, while the king sat on his royal throne in the royal house facing the entrance of the house. Notice that Esther here, before she goes before the king to intercede so that the king will protect the Jews from annihilation, she changes her garments into her royal garments, or her queenly garments, if you please. And then, of course, the king accepts Esther into his presence. And Esther says, could you please invite Haman to a banquet? And the king says, yes, I will do that. And so he's invited to the banquet. And then Esther says, could you invite Haman to come to a banquet tomorrow as well? And the king says, yes, I accede to your wishes. And of course, after that first banquet, we find Haman returning home, and he's just so happy because the queen has invited him to have lunch with the king, to have a banquet with the king. But his joy is suddenly ruined when suddenly he passes by where Mordecai is, and instead of Mordecai bowing and paying him homage and worship, Mordecai remains standing in his presence. And so Mordecai goes home, and he meets his wife Zeresh, and Zeresh says, listen, just take care of this. You know, build a gallows so that you can hang Mordecai on it. Get rid of him. So you have this shadowy woman figure behind Haman who is orchestrating to a certain extent the events that are taking place. Interestingly enough, the king that night after this first banquet could not sleep. And so in his insomnia, he asked one of his attendants to seek out something for him to read. And so the attendant goes to the library and he pulls out one of the historical annals of the kingdom of Medo-Persia. Now, I'm sure there were many volumes at this point because the kingdom of Medo-Persia had lasted from 539 all the way till 480. There were a lot of historical events. And he opens this volume and suddenly he begins to read a story about an individual who delivered his life. A plot was made to kill the king. And there was somebody who intervened and unveiled the plot and saved the life of the king. In other words, the good works of this individual were shown, that he served the king, that he loved the king, and these works had been written in the books, but he had not yet been rewarded. And so now it's interesting to notice that the king, and by the way, let's read about this in Esther 6 and verse 1. The king is actually going to call in Haman to ask him what needs to be done with this individual. Let's read Esther 6 and verse 1. It says, that night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the chronicles, and they were read before the king. And of course, the king reads about this individual who delivered his life. There are three things that I want us to notice, particularly here. First, the good works of this individual were examined. They were examined in his absence. And third, he was not yet rewarded. Now, it's interesting to notice in Esther chapter 6 and verses 7 through 9 that the king calls Haman in to ask for some counsel on what should be done with this individual. And of course, you know by now that the individual is Mordecai. Notice Esther 6 and verses 7 through 9. And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. In other words, you're going to treat him as a what? You're going to treat him as a king. Then let this robe and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor, then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Of course, Haman was thinking that he was that man. And so he says, I would like to occupy the place of the king. I would like to have the robe of the king. I would like to have the crown of the king. I want to sit on the horse of the king. I want everybody to recognize me. And as soon as he says this, the king says, that's an excellent idea. You do that with Mordecai. Notice Esther chapter 6 and verses 10 and 11. It says, then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew who sits within the king's gate. leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. See, now Mordecai is going to be rewarded. And it continues saying in verse 11, so Haman took the robe and the horse, arrayed Mordecai, and led him on horseback through the city square, and proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Now, all of these details we need to remember because we're going to come back to them. The idea of changing into her royal robes, the idea of examining the records in the absence of the person, and discovering what his reward should be, and then giving out the reward. All of these things are symbolic or typological of future events. Now, it's interesting to notice how this plot is unmasked, or how this plot is unveiled. Up to this point, the king is filled with wrath against the Jews because the religious figure has convinced him that these people are a menace to his kingdom. But now, the wrath of the king is not going to be directed anymore at the Jews and Mordecai. Suddenly, his wrath is going to be directed against his religious advisor who has given him the wrong kind of advice. Now, it's interesting to notice how this happens. There's a second banquet. And when Haman is at the second banquet, Esther, in his presence, tells the king about how this wicked Haman, she calls him wicked Haman, had prepared this plot to destroy all of her people along with her because her interests were welded with those of the people. And we're told that as a result, the wrath of the king was awakened. He was filled with wrath, and he got up from the table. It says that he was drinking wine at the table, and he was filled with wrath. I want you to notice the wine of wrath expression here. And he gets up and he leaves the room. He goes probably out of the palace to cool off a little bit. And of course, when he leaves, we find Haman coming to Esther and hanging on to Esther and saying, Esther, please intercede for me. Please save my life. Please intercede with the king so the king doesn't kill me. Interestingly enough, at this point, Esther refuses to intercede for Haman. Notice Esther chapter 7 and verse 7. It says there, then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine. Now I want you to remember that. Wrath and wine go together. From the banquet of wine, and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life. For he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. So now the tables are being turned. Now the wrath of the king is not directed against Mordecai and the Jews. Now the wrath of the king is directed against the religious advisor who has deceived him into thinking that these people are a menace to his kingdom. And to make a long story short, the story tells us that the king came back and he found Haman hanging on to Esther, and he actually thought that he was getting fresh with Esther, that Haman was getting fresh with Esther, and he was filled with even more rage. And the Bible tells us that as a result, the weapon that the king had prepared for Mordecai was used to destroy Haman. Notice what we find in the book of Esther, chapter 7 and verse 10, and then we'll jump down to chapter 9 and verse 25. It says there, so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. In other words, he dies with his own weapons. Then the king's wrath, what? Subsided. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letter that this wicked plot which Haman had devised against the Jews should return what? On his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Notice also Esther chapter 8 and verses 3 through 6. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears. Notice she's still interceding to protect her people, to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. In other words, the king is accepting his intercession with favor. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, if it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? Do you see that the interests of Esther are welded together with the interests of her people? They are her next of kin. And she is going to give her life, if necessary, to protect them, because she loves them. She says, if I perish, I perish. And then, of course, the day of battle came. You know, the decree of the king could not be revoked. The people on the day when the death decree was to be executed could still execute the death decree. But now the king gave a new decree that the Israelites could defend themselves when they were attacked on that day. Notice Esther chapter 8 and verses 11 and 12, and then we'll read chapter 9 and verses 2 and 5. It says in Esther 8, 11 and 12, by these letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or province that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them because the fear of them fell upon all people. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did what they pleased with those who hated them. Now I want you to notice one very interesting detail which is not directly mentioned in the book of Esther. Do you know that the reason why they were successful was not because of their strength, but because in the battle, angels of God took the battlefield? Notice what we find in Prophets and Kings, page 602. Prophets and Kings, page 602. Ellen White says here, angels that excel in strength had been commissioned by God to protect his people while they stood for their lives. In other words, angels of God took the battlefield, and therefore they were able to protect their lives. And then, of course, came the celebration after the deliverance. The very day in which the death decree was to be executed became a day of celebration and gladness and singing and peace and deliverance. Notice Esther chapter 9 and verses 17 and 18. It's speaking about the institution of a feast called Purim, which commemorates the deliverance of the Jews in the days of Esther. It says here, and on the 14th day of the month they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. And on the 14th day of the month they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. In other words, after the agony of the time of trouble, the agony of the death decree, the very day they were supposed to be exterminated, they are delivered by the angels of God. And now they have peace and they have joy and gladness, and they celebrate this feast with joy. It's interesting to notice that the Jews, even till this day, celebrate Purim. And you know, they celebrate it almost like a Mardi Gras. It's a period of just joy and happiness, and a time for them to give presents to one another because it commemorates this great deliverance by God. Now, something about the book of Esther is really interesting, and that is that the name of God is not mentioned in the book. It is the only book in the Bible where the name of God is not mentioned. And many people have wondered, why is the name of God absent from this book? I believe the reason is that God wanted to show Israel that He works in two different ways. He acts like He did when He delivered Israel from Egypt, with signs and wonders, plagues, opening up the sea, sending manna from heaven, bringing water from the rock. In other words, God sometimes is noisy in His deliverance. There are open, visible signs and wonders. But there's another way in which God works. You see, this was after the captivity. The prophetic voice was waning. God appeared to have forsaken Israel. And therefore Israel came to believe that perhaps God wasn't there with them anymore like He had been originally when He had shown by signal signs and wonders their deliverance from Egypt. You see, their deliverance from Egypt was a magnificent deliverance with signs and wonders and plagues. But here the deliverance from Babylon, there were no signs, there were no wonders. It just appeared to be events of historical circumstances taking place. But what God wants to show in the book of Esther is, listen, though I might appear to be absent, you can see my invisible hand working for your deliverance. In other words, there were so many events that happened one right after the other. For example, Esther becoming queen in the first place. You can read it in chapters 1 and 2. And the books being opened. And the king being willing to accept Esther, even though she had broken the law of the court. And how the wrath of the king was overturned. There were just too many providential events taking place for this to be historical coincidences. So God was telling Israel, I'm still here. I'm present. You can see my hand working. I believe that this is the reason why God is not mentioned explicitly by name in the book. Furthermore, this story is very similar to the story of Joseph. Suppose that the story of Joseph did not have the name of God in it. Would you think that there were too many historical coincidences taking place in order for this just to be an accident? Of course. You know, the fact that he's sold by his brothers, he ends up in Potiphar's house, and then he ends up in prison, you know, where the dream of the cupbearer is interpreted, and then the cupbearer leaves for 2 years. He forgets Joseph, and then suddenly he remembers, and Joseph is brought before the king, and all of the providence is with his brothers. You know, you would say, certainly, all of these things cannot be a coincidence. There are just too many things happening simultaneously that show the hand of God. And so the story of Joseph is very similar to the story of Esther. Only in the story of Joseph, you have reference to God. God, in the days of Joseph, does not work by overt signs and wonders and thunder and lightning and miracles and things like this. God works in an invisible way by the historical events that take place in a certain sequence. Now, I would like to mention 5 principles of interpretation which we're going to use in order to understand the prophetic meaning of the book of Esther. And we'll do this in closing this first session before we get into the prophetic significance of this book. The first principle is that every passage of the Scriptures has Jesus Christ as its hero. You see, the hero, or the heroine, if you speak, of the book of Esther is not Esther. Jesus himself said to the disciples on the road to Emmaus that from Moses and all of the prophets and all of the Scriptures, he showed them the things concerning himself. And a little later on there in Luke 24, he said, from the Psalms, Jesus also showed them about himself. So this story of Esther is not about Esther. This story is actually a story about Jesus. Jesus is at the center of the book of Esther. Second principle, history repeats itself on a worldwide scale. In other words, what happened locally in the kingdom of Medo-Persia with the literal Jews is to be understood as a series of events which will be repeated in the future on a worldwide scale. In other words, the small-scale story of Esther is really a worldwide parable about end-time events. You know, it's kind of like the Hebrew sanctuary. That was a local parable of the whole plan of salvation of Jesus throughout the course of the history of the world. You find other stories, the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, which took place on the literal mountain Moriah. It actually represented the sacrifice of Jesus for the sins of the whole world. In other words, the stories, the small-scale stories in the Bible are actually prophecies which point to global end-time events. Number 3, we need to understand that every book of the Bible meets and ends in the book of Revelation. This means that every single story of the Bible before the book of Revelation has some relationship to the last book of the Bible. And this means that the book of Esther must be closely related, it must be closely linked with the book of Revelation. In the 4th place, we need to understand that Israel is not literal Israel at the end of time. Israel is to be understood symbolically. In other words, Israel is spiritual. It represents those people who have committed their lives to Jesus Christ. So what happened with literal Israel in the Old Testament actually is symbolic of worldwide events that take place in the end time with spiritual Israel, those who have committed their lives to Jesus Christ. You know, it's as the Apostle Paul said in Galatians chapter 3 and verse 29. He said, "And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." What this means is that the experiences of literal Israel in the Old Testament actually foreshadow the events that will take place with spiritual Israel at the end of time. And principle number 5, which is related to this, is that the literal individuals in the book of Esther represent worldwide systems and movements at the end of time. In other words, Mordecai is symbolic of a worldwide group of people. Esther is symbolic of someone far greater than herself. We find that Haman and Zeresh represent global, worldwide religious systems. We find that King Ahasuerus or Xerxes represents not one king at the end of time, but the kings of the earth and of the whole world. In other words, the book of Esther is really a prophetic book. It is not only a book about history, it is a book about prophecy. In fact, we're going to notice as we study the 2nd session that every single detail of the book of Esther is actually a parable, a local and small-scale parable of events which will take place at the end of time in the exact sequence in which they are presented in the book of Esther. So this is a magnificent book. Now allow me to review what we've studied so that we have clearly in our minds what we're going to talk about in our 2nd session. First of all, there are 4 protagonists in this story: a political figure, a religious coalition, a persecuted figure, and an intercessory figure. The issues involved are long-standing. Behind this plot is Satan. The issues are worship and obedience to God's commandments. We find that the civil powers are going to proclaim a decree of worship. And when this decree of worship is not obeyed, the religious system is going to be filled with wrath. The accusations against God's people will be very similar. There's a small minority spread all over the kingdom. They have different laws than the laws of the kingdom. If you allow them to remain, the kingdom will be thrown into upheaval. There was a death decree, and this death decree was universal. This death decree was dated. This death decree was religious hatred imposed by the political power. People were told to be ready for the execution of this decree. And we also noticed that this decree was irrevocable and unchangeable. We notice also that the king and his advisors sat down to drink wine. We notice in this story that a time of trouble ensues with crying out and fasting and agony. We notice that the intercessor then steps onto the stage. Her interests are welded together with the interests of her people, Queen Esther. And she actually says, if I have to give up my life, I'll give up my life for the salvation of my people. She becomes the intercessor to protect Israel. She changes her garments before she goes before the king. Memory books are opened, and the destiny of Mordecai is revealed. The plot is then unveiled. The individual who prepared the plot now suffers the wrath of the king. And the weapons which were going to be used to destroy Mordecai and the Jews actually became weapons to destroy the advisors of the king. We also noticed in our story that on the day of the battle, angels of God were with the Jews, helping them overcome their enemies. And immediately after, you have feasting and you have gladness as a result of the deliverance of God. So this is a fascinating story. But it is not only a story, it is a prophecy. And in our second session, we're going to notice that the hero of this story is Jesus. We're going to notice that this story will repeat on a worldwide scale. We will notice that this story has a very close relationship with the book of Revelation. We will notice that at the end of time, this story will be fulfilled with spiritual Israel. And we will notice that every individual in this story is actually a type or a symbol, not of individuals in the end time, but of worldwide systems which will oppose God and which will be opposed by the wicked powers of the world.